Postmodernism is a very general term used to analyze the things around us. Postmodernism arose as a direct response to modernism, the progression towards a more urbanized, unified society. In modernism, patriotism and nationalism became common self-identifiers, while religious identity took a back seat. Succeeding the Industrial Revolution, the populace began to entrust institutions to progress society. Institutions such as capitalism, fascism, and communism were adopted and implemented with social, economic, and industrial progress in mind. Conversely, postmodernism is the questioning, challenging, and subsequent rejection of modern ideas and the institutions it conceived. This juxtaposition arose after World War II and during the Cold War. Wartime saw extreme devastation and the introduction of nuclear weapons. Observing how easily the world could destroy itself, people became disillusioned and started questioning the very institutions they once trusted. This disillusionment manifested itself as a lens through which to view the world, a lens that would dissect the rationale of modern ideas and boil them down to their most rudimentary values, leaving it up for the individual to arbitrate their validity. This sense of individuality allowed the people to express what issues they found interesting through activism and art. As television became more and more accessible, postmodern thought began to influence the writing and ideals that television stood for and sought to convey. In the same way that people questioned social and political institutions, writers and showrunners began challenging the tropes and archetypes that had previously dominated programming. One such example is Late Night with David Letterman. At a time where every channel had multiple talk shows and competing time slots, David Letterman stood out. Late night programming at the time largely borrowed from Johnny Carson, and while Letterman used the same format, he did so in a distinct way. The first episode of Late Night with David Letterman began with Larry Melman's homage to Frankenstein. The first comedic sketch was Letterman giving a very sarcastic tour of his studio. He would often include members of the production in his comedy sketches. But perhaps most notable of all is his irreverence towards the celebrities he interviews. Rather than the usual fluff about celebrities and whatever they're promoting at the time, Letterman was not afraid to make them angry.
We didn't discuss this in the pre-interview.
Around the same time period, Seinfeld filled a similar void for sitcoms. Seinfeld lacks the conflict resolution that traditional sitcoms would have at the time. The nuclear family and end-of-episode lesson would be foregone for a group of friends with very overt problems. What drives the plot in Seinfeld is not the characters' goal-oriented actions, but rather impromptu decisions that culminate in the consequence of said decision. When a goal of theirs is achieved, it is usually taken from them due to external forces. The show often acts as a meta-narrative as well, constantly being self-referential.
Just talking? Well, what's the show about? It's about nothing.
This acknowledgement of critiques or shortcomings is in itself empty, as it constructs or challenges nothing. Ultimately, Seinfeld is a cynical show, conveying the idea that our problems are somehow unsolvable.
Every decision I've ever made in my entire life has been wrong.
Seinfeld and Late Night with David Letterman were immensely successful and helped pave way for an entire generation of ironic, cynical, and irreverent programming. However, the same qualities that made postmodern television thoughtful made it profitable, and in turn greatly overused. Postmodern elements became extremely widespread, from talk shows to advertisements. This creates a fundamental problem with postmodern television. Irony serves to criticize, self-referentiality acknowledges one's own fault, and irreverence challenges the well-respected. Yet alone, these tools have no redeeming qualities. While everything on television is trying to be ironic, it subverts the purpose of irony. When everything is cynical, irreverent, and self-referential, it no longer challenges ideas, but rather reinforces them. These postmodern elements have become the very thing they were made to criticize. David Foster Wallace was an author and professor who took this idea one step further. Not only does irony lose its purpose, but also it tyrannizes us. Much of David Foster Wallace's work involves irony and metafiction, but its purpose, as he claims, is to be morally passionate, what it means to be human. Television's growing influence on literature and pop culture is what David Foster Wallace feared most.
Because you want your art to be hip and seem cool to people. You want people to like the stuff. But a great deal of what passes for hip or cool is now highly, highly commercially driven. And some of it I think is important art. I think The Simpsons is important art. On the other hand, it's also, in my opinion, relentlessly sort of corrosive to the soul, and everything is parodied and everything is ridiculous. And maybe I'm old, but for my part, I can be steeped in about an hour of it, and then I sort of have to walk away and look at a flower or something. I think if there's something to be talked about, that thing is this weird conflict between what my girlfriend calls the inner sap, the part of us that can really wholeheartedly weep at stuff, and the part of us that has to live in a world of smart, jaded, sophisticated people and wants very much to be taken seriously by those people. I don't know that it's that irony tyrannizes us, but the fashions that are so easy to criticize but are so incredibly powerful and authentic seeming when we're inside them tyrannize us. I don't know that it's ever been any different.
This is what resonates with me the most. There is this need to be respected and to be smart, but when everything is constantly being cynical and self-aware and ironic, it gets depressing. It propagates this unhealthy outlook on life, in which being naive is looked down upon, and genuine human emotion is set aside to be witty and entertaining. This led to a new form of narrative, one that combined the gooey emotion with postmodern elements. Irony is to not mean what you say, and so the contrast to that would be sincerity. This new sincerity allowed more cynical characters to contrast with more heartfelt ones, without any devaluing of the two. Characters could be unabashedly pathetic or naive without it being portrayed as a joke or in any way negative. My personal favorite embodiment of this idea is community. The show contains many postmodern elements, yet is sincere to its core.
Your simulations are nothing more than anxieties. You're afraid you don't fit in. You're afraid you'll be alone. Great news! You share that with all of us, so you'll never be alone.
The show follows Jeff Winger, a cynical lawyer who starts a study group for his own personal gain. He gives off this facade of being a cool, uncaring individual, while in reality he's very insecure.
Once the shame and the fear wore off, I was just glad they thought I was pretty.
Once he acknowledges his own flaws and those of his friends, he's able to properly connect and care for them.
Harrison Ford is irradiating her testicles with microwave satellite transmissions!
The show parodies many tropes, but does so in a constructive, enlivening way. For example, Abed, while being neurodivergent, creates the most deep human connections, rather than being portrayed as socially inept or downright vitriolic. Troy, the high school sports star, is allowed to become a nerd and express his emotions without being emasculated or looked down upon. Ultimately, the show is about our need for human connection and people coming together as a community. In a world with constant bad news, new problems to worry about, and a sense of helplessness, these shows allow us to not always have to be witty or clever. They allow us to not always have to be intelligent or respected. Sometimes we can just be human.